I just had to show you something. So this is the binge-restrict cycle that is quite famous in its simple form, that's shown online a lot, that I think a lot of people are familiar with. And I wanted to kind of demonstrate why this essentially is entirely useless as a cycle to show, because I think it implies that, okay, well, you binge because you have increased hunger and cravings, and you have increased hunger and cravings because you restrict, and so basically just stop restricting and you'll stop binging. But that doesn't work, and that is the equivalent of saying just stop dieting to someone that has trouble with binging. And the reason why it doesn't work can be shown, or the reason why this can be such invalidating advice can be demonstrated by this. So this is still a very kind of brief summary of some other things that are going on behind the scenes, which make this far too simplistic. Even this is still too simplistic, but I'm going to use it to demonstrate my point. So here's the physical and mental restriction part. Here's the increased hunger and cravings part. Here's the binge part. And here's the guilt and shame part. So it's still the same cycle, but showing what else is going on. So the reason why it's not as simple as saying just stop dieting or just stop restricting yourself, in part, is because one of the drivers for restricting is a lack of trust around food. I restrict mentally, I've got to keep tabs on what I'm eating. I can't just let myself eat whatever I want when I want, right? I can't just stop dieting because I don't trust myself around food. And I don't trust myself around food because of a variety of different reasons, including maybe I use food emotionally, and that hasn't been taken care of, right? I use food emotionally and other people don't, let's say. I'm preoccupied with food. I think about food a lot, so I don't trust myself around it. I check out. I feel like I'm not in control when I binge, so I don't have trust in myself. I binge. That's another reason why I lack trust in myself around food. And so in order for someone to feel okay about not mentally restricting or physically restricting anymore, they need to have full trust in themselves around food, which means that these other things, and again, there are more, but these other things need to be taken care of, which means that in order to stop mentally and physically restricting, i.e. stop dieting, someone needs to know that they have very little emotional use of food. They need to know that they're not going to binge. They need to know that they are not going to be checking out, so they feel in control, healthy control with food. They need to not be thinking about food all of the time, so that they can have full trust in themselves. And then maybe, just maybe, they might consider stopping the restriction. But that still probably wouldn't be enough, because that it also implies that restriction is the only reason why someone binges. Well, increased hunger and cravings is the only reason why someone binges, and that absolutely is not true. And we know that that's not true because lots of people with a healthy relationship with food can feel hungrier sometimes and have more cravings sometimes, and they don't binge, right? And trust me, someone that is binging, they're never aware of this. They know, they have this intuitive sense that it's not even as simple as just stop dieting, even if they had full trust in themselves. And that's because in part, the urge to binge, right, that we're talking about, the urge to binge can come from increased cravings and can increase hunger. Yes, there's a driving force, absolutely, but in combination typically with a lack of permission to eat. When you drill it right down, it's a lack of permission to eat. There are other things, of course, but those two tend to be the most prominent when you drill right down into stuff. But an urge to binge doesn't even mean that someone's going to binge. Someone can have an urge to binge and not binge. Trust me on this one, because I see it pretty frequently. In fact, it's not entirely unusual for clients to have the urge to binge, begin a binge, and then stop, which anyone that binges can appreciate just how unbelievably impressive that is, to stop halfway in a binge. It's the urge to binge mixed with a desire to not binge. So having both the urge to binge and the desire not to binge, which is pretty common, that leads to this paradoxical situation, which is so overwhelming. Both sides are equally as strong, and then it can lead to checking out. And checking out is a good way to describe that sense of I'm not in control, I'm out of control. Everyone's always in control of their actions and their thoughts, always. This checking out, this deliberate I'm not going to think about the consequences. I'm not going to think really about what I'm doing because I'm completely torn, leading to this sense of checking out absolutely can make someone feel like they are out of control. And when they check out, then comes the binge. But look at this. This is what I call a mind game. Lack of trust around food, I describe as a mind game because it can be self-fulfilling. So someone has an understandable lack of trust in themselves around food, completely understandable why they would feel that way, but that lack of trust in and of itself is a perpetuating factor in the binge eating. So it just goes round and around and around and around. It's cyclical, right? We can follow it. Lack of trust means more preoccupation with food. Obviously, someone's going to be on guard a lot. They're going to be thinking about food a lot because they don't trust themselves around it. They're going to be analyzing a lot more. That's going to lead to increased cravings, or it's going to drive increased cravings. That's going to drive the urge to binge. That's going to drive the checking out, and it's going to drive the binging, which then in turn refuels this sense of lack of trust. See, I can't be trusted because I binge. And it's like, well, hang on a second. One of the reasons why you binge was because you had a lack of trust in yourself. And looking at all of these and how everything interplays with each other, it's absolutely apparent why people that are binging feel so stuck and confused and feel like there's no way out. There is a way out, it's just not as simple as this. The way out is understanding all of this and setting up a new system which positively feeds into itself, not negatively. This is a perfectly formed, not this layout here, but binge eating, disordered eating is a perfectly formed system which is self-perpetuating and self-maintaining because of all of how everything interlinks together. And it's the same with a healthy relationship with food. The system for a healthy relationship with food is self-maintaining and self-perpetuating. And this also is a good demonstration of why just doing one thing is not going to solve binge eating. It doesn't work like that. Let's take feeling guilty and shameful after binge eating, for example, which is completely understandable, right? Part of that comes from negative body image often. So I feel like I've done something wrong because I really want to have a different body and I've binged, and so I've interrupted that, and so it can fuel this guilt and shame. A lack of understanding of what creates binging can drive guilt and shame, because a lack of understanding can mean that someone is blaming themselves for lack of willpower, for example, blaming themselves for something which really is not a personal failing or a lack of willpower at all. And then because they feel guilty and shameful, they don't get help, or it's secretive, right? They're not talking to people about it, which means that they're not receiving the right help and understanding. So that perpetuates the lack of understanding, which perpetuates the guilt. And this is a mini cycle which gets set up. And this is an issue because the guilt often leads to a desire to do better, to be better, which can perpetuate black and white thinking. So all or nothing thinking. So, oh, I've had a binge or I've been off the rails, but it's okay. I'm going to allow myself to feel better by being really, really good and getting really excited about sticking to a plan for a really long time and losing weight, and that pendulum swinging, black and white thinking. And that is a perpetuating factor in binging, right? So there's another cycle that gets set up, and it can just go round and round and around and around, making people feel trapped when they're not. The guilt and shame can also lead to a desire to do better, to be better, then creating a plan for weight loss. And then that then leads to the physical restriction and the mental restriction, of course, which then keeps the cycle going in and of itself, or the system going in and of itself. A lack of understanding here can also drive the attempt to rely on willpower. Seeing this as a willpower issue, I've just got to stick to a plan. I've just got to do better, right? I've just got to apply more force, apply more rules, which makes a lot of sense because they don't understand what's really going on. They don't understand the complexity of what's going on. And then trying to rely on willpower will, of course, lead to willpower exhaustion because we only have a finite amount of willpower that we can maintain. And there's a lot of willpower that needs to be used because it takes a lot of willpower to ignore cravings, fight off cravings, ignore hunger, deal with the preoccupation with food, to live with a lack of trust in self. That takes a lot of willpower and mental energy and creates a lot of stress. And stress and willpower exhaustion, they are driving factors in wanting a sense of relief from that. We're human, right? If we're under loads of stress and got willpower exhaustion, we are going to want relief from that. And relief from that manifests itself or drives the urge to binge, the urge just to let go completely. So the reliance on willpower that someone is setting up because they don't understand what's going on, so they're setting up willpower, believing that's the answer or having no other better option. They're doing that because they're trying to help themselves. They're trying to be better, not because they hate themselves, but because they are trying to help themselves. The very thing here that they're doing to try to help themselves is fueling the problem which they don't want to have. Saying to someone that is struggling with binge eating or disordered eating that it would be a good idea for them to stop guilting themselves or shaming themselves for eating is all well and good and meant with really good intentions, but fundamentally just not particularly helpful. Because if you ask people who are binging, and I have, for what purpose are you guilting yourself after? Because you're doing it, you're engaging with it, it's not happening to you, you're creating it and propagating it. For what purpose are you guilting and shaming yourself for it? Invariably, the answer that you'll get is because it motivates me to basically do better next time. It motivates me to think about what I don't want. It's being used often as a motivating tool. For someone that's binging, the idea of not guilting themselves or not engaging in guilt after binging can feel the same as just accepting and embracing chaos. But without guilt, they'll often think, how will I be motivated to change? And I really need to change. If I don't guilt myself, I'm just going to be allowing myself to be binging all of the time. It would be absolute anarchy. The guilt and shame leads to this desire to do and be better, but also the desire to do and be better sets up the guilting and shaming. Guilting ourselves is another mind game, which I talk about and reference, because the guilt is essentially saying I don't have permission to eat, or it's driving that sense of I don't have permission to eat, or I should eat less, right? Essentially, I do not have unconditional permission to eat. And that then drives all of this, ultimately driving binging. And so it just goes around and around and around. Trying to help myself by guilting myself, which then is fueling the very problem which I don't want to have. Hence why I call it a mind game. And don't forget, while all of this is going on, they're still thinking that the answer lies somewhere in willpower and a sense of control and eating less, essentially some variation of dieting, even if it looks more flexible, just some variation of having control over food, they believe is the answer. And if you take away guilt and their motivating factor, you take away the willpower, then they will look at it often as I will never have control over food. Because again, in their mind, they can't be trusted around food at all. They can't be trusted around food. They can't be, quote unquote, an intuitive eater. They can just be free to eat whatever they want because they can't be trusted around food. To someone that's been struggling for binge eating for quite a while, the concept of knowing what to eat, when to eat, why to eat, and how to eat without a lot of analysis and thought behind it is completely alien to the point of absurd. Typically, they do not believe or have a strong sense that they can just eat, quote unquote, normally, because there's so much evidence to support this narrative that they absolutely cannot be trusted around food, that they're naturally really preoccupied with food. They've spent a long time thinking about food all of the time. They have this increased hunger, they have these increased cravings, they binge, they've got all of this going on. And so suggesting that someone take away the guilt and the shame is great advice, often, in my opinion, so long as a new motivator is set up and a new motivator for something other than dieting and restricting needs to be set up. A new motivator, but also the framework of how to make decisions around food that aren't reliant on willpower and aren't reliant on rules. And that's obviously a very, very big discussion, which goes beyond the scope of this video. I'm just illustrating that you can't just take one of these things away. The reason why it's there in the first place, the positive intent that it's there for in the first place, does need to be accounted for, and it needs to be accounted for in a way that makes complete sense to the individual, because otherwise they're not going to do it, understandably, because they live day in and day out in this sense of I can't be trusted, I'm out of control. Whatever is suggested, in my experience, needs to make total sense in order for someone to relax enough to know that they're in good hands, everything makes sense, and then they can start letting some of these things go. I made a video called Worst Advice for Binge Eating, and in that I was talking about things that people say are a good idea for your relationship with food that may seem like a good idea, but really terrible idea often when in isolation and when said to someone that's binging. For example, the advice of just eat everything in moderation. It sounds harmless enough, right? It sounds simple enough as well. Not to someone that's struggling with disordered eating, because someone with disordered eating will typically take that suggestion of just eat everything in moderation. They will form it into a rule system which makes sense to them, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, which they will then try to enforce with willpower. They can't just do it naturally. They can't just eat everything in moderation naturally, because all of this is going on. And it becomes a new state of mental restriction. Even if they're honoring all of their hunger in this, if you say to someone with disordered eating and binge eating, honor all of your hunger and just eat everything in moderation, you're probably not doing them a service. In fact, you may be making them feel even more like something is wrong with them, because that seems like good advice, but it's not that simple when you're stuck in this system. Because it will turn it into mental restriction, it will feel like mental restriction, and then they will end up probably having a binge and thinking, even when I honor my hunger, even when I eat everything in moderation, so I allow myself some chocolate sometimes, I still end up binging. What is wrong with me? But that is such an unfair conclusion to come to, but it absolutely does happen because of this lack of full understanding. In my experience, and I work day in, day out very successfully with people to move past binge eating to a healthy relationship with food, which they feel incredibly secure in once they have it. So I like to think that I know what I'm talking about, but I can only speak from my experience. All of the different areas and perpetuating factors, of which there is far more than just this. I don't say that to overwhelm you if you're struggling. It's not overwhelming once you get stuck into it. And hopefully it's validating to know that there's more than this as well, because it might be why you feel so very trapped and confused, and why that's absolutely not your fault, because it's a complex system. Learnable, totally achievable, see it every day, but complex. All of these different areas need to be accounted for. And I'll demonstrate that with an example, which I use all the time. Let's say that someone doesn't have this going on. They have a healthy relationship with food. Their system is set up for a healthy relationship with food, which is maintaining. They've always had a healthy relationship with food, no problem. Now let's imagine that that person, we take them to the scale, we weigh them, we look at that number, and we say, okay, you have to stay this number, you have to stay this weight. If your weight goes up by even a pound when you step on the scale, you've got to weigh yourself every day, then by consequence, you're going to feel like a failure, you're going to feel insecure, you're going to feel limited, you're not really going to want to go out, it's going to change what you want to wear, it's going to change how you feel about yourself, it's going to change how confident you feel, all of that. That will by default happen if your weight goes up by even a pound. AKA, we give them negative body image. We make loads of their sense of value and self-worth and happiness riding on their weight. They had a healthy relationship with food right up to that point. And just by introducing this one thing, which really is a lot of stuff, but for the sake of this video, just by introducing this one thing, the system starts to get set up and starts to chug and starts to self-maintain and escalate and spiral. Someone can have a perfectly healthy relationship with food, never struggled, and you introduce this into it in a significant way, and they are going to start analyzing their food, keeping an eye on their food, noticing how food starts to impact their weight. Their preoccupation with food is going to start to grow, and now we're getting into it. Now the increased cravings start to come, and then the urge to binge starts to arise. They start to feel lack of permission to eat, and this system starts to develop itself. Because this system starts to get set up, there will be an experience where they step on the scale and their weight's going up. 99 times out of 100, that's going to happen. Now, when the consequence of their weight going up is insecurity, feeling like a failure, they're down on themselves, they feel low, they've got all of these negative consequences to it, they feel limited, typically they're not going to continue to live life as they were before, because they feel different emotionally. They feel emotionally different. And when we're feeling insecure and down, we just typically interact with life differently. And what is really common is that we'll get this shrinking of what I like to call the life circle. The life circle starts to shrink. Things start to get taken out of life. Not intentionally, just might see friends a little bit less often, might be a little less outgoing, might start to care less about certain things, especially when the preoccupation with food is also growing. We've only got a certain amount of brain space, right? Preoccupation with food starts to grow, and thoughts of what does my body look like and how much I care about my body, as that's growing, then there's just less space to care about other stuff. So the life and what's filling it and sense of identity can start to shrink, which becomes a perpetuating factor in and of itself often. And I'll show you one example of how. Again, it's not a complete system. As sense of self starts to shrink and there's insecurity and there's less in life, that can drive unmet needs. Sense of belonging, connection, fun, adventure, creativity, things like that. Hopefully that makes sense to you how that can happen. You've got unmet needs now growing and a growing preoccupation with food. Well, guess what is likely to increase? Emotional uses of food. Emotional uses of food to deal with the discomfort of unmet needs, whether consciously or unconsciously. Often it's not fully conscious with full self-awareness. Emotional uses in food in terms of literally just turning to food to feel better because there's more negative emotional states which aren't being met elsewhere, or that's shrinking, in combination with this desire for relief is going up for all the reasons we spoke about before. This desire for relief is going up, and they've had enough experiences now of binging and knowing that it is relieving in the moment. It's devastating, it's awful, yes, but it is also relieving in the moment for a lot of people. And so these associations are formed, right? Which again can drive emotional uses of food just by pure association. In fact, when emotional uses of food starts to go up and those associations start to be formed, then absolutely it can increase cravings, increase how much someone is thinking about food, because the number of cues for thinking about food starts to rise. It grows out of what it was before, which is basically only really wanting food when physically hungry most of the time, not all of the time, in a healthy relationship with food. And all of a sudden, those cues start to increase and associations are formed. Oh, when I feel stressed, I start to turn to food. When I feel lonely, when I'm getting exhausted from willpower at the end of the day, when I'm sitting watching TV in the evening, looking for relaxation, I'm also now thinking about food. And of course, as all of these cravings increase, then that feeds in. And as I say, it's just a perfectly developed, often very unhelpful, but very brilliant in a lot of ways, system, a disordered eating, binge eating system. And just having then emotional uses of food, which are tending to needs, which someone might be completely unaware of, that propagates the unmet needs, right? It works back and forth. They just ping pong off of each other, because so long as food is being used emotionally, those needs and those emotional states are not being met in the ways that they are quote unquote meant to be, which leads to more unmet needs. And it just, as I say, can just ping pong escalating each other here. And the damage that this can do to someone's sense of identity and self-esteem, just this part alone, ping ponging off each other, can be very significant. When you've got lowered sense of identity and lowered sense of self-esteem, and changing your body seems like a good idea to get more confidence. It all makes sense. More going on than just this, but all of it makes sense. You make sense. Even if you feel very confused right now, if you feel very confused, then that's just an indicator that you're kind of getting it. You're sensing that it's more complicated than, well, just eat everything in moderation. There's this thing called psychological reactance, which is basically the phenomenon of wanting what we can't have. Lack of permission to eat can drive psychological reactance, wanting more food, right? In times of emotional stress or feeling down, or some quick relief is wanted, absolutely. That can drive emotional uses of food. Just the factor of not having permission to eat, literally whatever you want, whenever you want, can drive emotional uses of food. It's all very ironic, really. Not that simple, obviously, as more goes into it, but as a driving factor, absolutely. And that's what's going on over here. Lack of permission to eat, in addition to feeling stressed out, willpower exhausted, desire for relief, which is a kind of emotional use of food, urge to binge. You have this desire for emotionally using food, you want relief, you want a lot of relief, in combination with checking out. There's the binge. In comes the shame and the guilt to try to do better. Let's rely on willpower, bring in the next diet, and off it goes. So you can't say to someone, just stop using food emotionally. I mean, you could, and someone could try it, but they're only going to be using willpower to enforce that if that's all they're trying to do. Just stop using food emotionally. They have no choice really but to use force to do that, unless they start getting all of their needs met, tending to their emotional needs in really satisfying and fulfilling ways. And if they start doing that, then maybe their life circle and sense of self starts to expand, and maybe that then makes them care less about their body and value themselves less on their body. Maybe their body image improves, and you can see how you can start to reverse engineer this system. And again, please be aware that it is more complex than this. There's a lot more going on in this. If it was this simple, then I'd only work with clients for 20 minutes. Nevertheless, I wanted this video to serve as conceptually understanding, if you've been struggling with disordered eating and binge eating, why just focusing on one or two different areas may not be helpful at all, and why that's not your fault. And hopefully this has been validating, and hopefully the seed has been planted that you can move away from binging, you can move away from disordered eating. It's just that everything needs to be accounted for. And also, it's beautiful in a lot of ways, because hopefully from this you can start to see as well why, when I've seen people develop a healthy relationship with food and the way that they do it in my system that I use for working, they do more than just develop peace with food, right? And develop a balanced way of eating that comes naturally to them. You know, because we're involving things like increasing life and increasing sense of self. Yes, to support the journey of developing a healthy relationship with food, but there's way more that comes out of looking at that and exploring that and addressing that than just having a healthy relationship with food, right? I often say you can't develop a healthy relationship with food if you've been really struggling with disordered eating and remain the same as a person in the most beautiful way. I hope this has helped in some way or another.
Hi, lovely. I know that developing a healthy relationship with food, a peaceful relationship with food, isn't necessarily the easiest or most straightforward thing in the world. And so if you find that you do need some additional help, please feel free to check out what we put in the description for you, or book a call. Between me and the rest of the team, we've now successfully helped over 100 people to move past binge eating, past disordered eating, past negative body image. And if you think that we could be of some use, then check out what we put below for you.